When nothing seems to be working, faith feels hardest to hold on to. Yet this is the very moment when faith is most powerful. Dr. David Yonggi Cho taught that faith is not dependent on visible progress or favorable circumstances. Many people believe only as long as they see improvement. But true faith continues even when there is no change at all. Faith that survives silence, delay, and disappointment is the kind of faith that moves God's hand. In seasons where doors remain closed and prayers appear unanswered, faith must shift its foundation. Instead of trusting outcomes, faith learns to trust God Himself. Dr. Cho emphasized that circumstances are temporary and unstable, but God's word is unchanging. When everything around you seems uncertain, faith anchors itself in God's promises rather than emotional reactions. This kind of faith does not panic when nothing is working, because it knows God is still in control. Faith also grows stronger through resistance. Just as muscles develop through pressure, faith matures when tested. Dr. Cho explained that God allows seasons where progress feels slow, so faith can deepen beyond surface-level belief. These moments separate emotional faith from spiritual conviction. When faith remains steady without external confirmation, it becomes unshakable. What once depended on feelings transforms into confident trust. Even when circumstances contradict belief, faith continues to speak and act with expectation. Dr. Cho taught that faith does not wait for improvement before believing, it believes first. This inner decision keeps hope alive. While others may give up, faith holds firm, knowing that God's work often begins where human effort ends. Faith understands that visible results are not the measure of God's activity. Ultimately, faith that remains effective in difficult seasons produces the greatest testimonies. Dr. David Yonggi Cho often reminded believers that breakthroughs are born from perseverance, not convenience. When nothing seems to work, faith keeps trusting, keeps praying, and keeps standing. That steady faith becomes the bridge between delay and deliverance, proving that God's power is strongest when human strength is exhausted. When nothing is working, it often feels as if God is silent or distant, but Dr. David Yonggi Cho taught that this silence does not mean absence. God frequently works in ways that are hidden from human sight. Just because change is not visible does not mean progress is not taking place. Many of God's greatest works begin in the unseen realm, where faith is being strengthened and foundations are being laid. Dr. Cho explained that God's process usually starts internally before it manifests externally. While we wait for situations to change, God is often changing us, shaping our character, refining our motives, and deepening our dependence on Him. This invisible work prepares us to handle the blessing when it arrives. If God were to act immediately, we might receive the answer but miss the growth that comes with waiting. The unseen work of God requires trust. Dr. Cho emphasized that faith must believe in God's activity even when there is no evidence. This kind of faith does not demand proof. It rests in the nature of God. Just as seeds grow silently beneath the soil before breaking through, God's answers develop quietly. Faith learns patience by trusting the process rather than rushing the outcome. God's invisible work also protects us. Dr. Cho taught that delays can be divine protection, steering us away from harm or premature decisions. What feels like stagnation may actually be alignment. God may be arranging people, resources, and timing in ways that are beyond our understanding. Faith trusts that God sees the full picture while we see only a small part. Eventually, what God has been doing invisibly becomes visible. Dr. David Yonggi Cho often reminded believers that when God's timing is fulfilled, change can happen suddenly. What once felt delayed appears in a moment of breakthrough. Those who trusted during the silence discover that God was working all along. Faith that believes in God's unseen work finds peace even before the answer arrives, knowing that nothing done by God is ever wasted. When nothing is working, the greatest battle often takes place in the mind and through the words we speak. Dr. David Yonggi Cho taught that thoughts and words are powerful forces that either strengthen faith or weaken it. In difficult seasons, the natural response is to focus on the problem, speak fear, and rehearse failure. However, faith begins to collapse when the mind and mouth continually agree with negative circumstances instead of God's promises. Dr. Cho emphasized that faith grows when thoughts are deliberately guided by God's word. This does not mean ignoring reality, but choosing which truth has the final authority. Problems may be real, but God's promises are greater. When believers meditate on God's word, their thinking slowly shifts from doubt to trust. Over time, faith becomes the dominant voice, silencing fear and confusion. This mental alignment is essential when external progress is absent. Words play a crucial role in sustaining faith during hardship. Dr. Cho taught that what we speak consistently becomes what we believe deeply. Negative confession strengthens discouragement, while faith-filled words nurture hope. Speaking God's promises out loud reinforces belief, even when emotions resist. These spoken declarations are not empty repetition. They train the heart to remain focused on God rather than circumstances. Aligning words with God's promises also changes the spiritual atmosphere. Dr. Cho believed that faith-filled speech invites peace and strength into moments of stress. When everything feels stuck, choosing to speak life instead of defeat keeps faith active. Words of faith act as a shield, protecting the heart from despair and preventing discouragement from taking control. Over time, disciplined thinking and consistent confession produce inner stability. Dr. David Yonggi Cho taught that when the mind and mouth agree with God, faith becomes resilient. Even if circumstances remain unchanged, the believer experiences strength, clarity, and peace. This alignment does not instantly solve problems, but it keeps faith alive long enough for God's work to unfold, proving that victory often begins internally before it appears outwardly. When nothing is working and strength feels completely drained, persistence in prayer becomes the lifeline of faith. Dr. David Yonggi Cho taught that prayer is not a last resort, but the sustaining force that keeps hope alive when everything else fails. In moments of discouragement, prayer shifts the focus away from problems and places it back into God's hands. Even when answers do not come immediately, prayer keeps the heart connected to God's presence and power. Persistent prayer is not about repeating words without meaning. It is about refusing to disconnect from God. Dr. Cho emphasized that prayer during hardship is often quiet, honest, and sometimes filled with tears. God is not offended by weakness. In fact, it is often in brokenness that prayer becomes most powerful. When nothing seems to work, prayer becomes less about asking and more about trusting, less about control and more about surrender. Through persistent prayer, hope is gradually restored. Dr. Cho taught that prayer has the ability to calm the inner storm even before circumstances change. Anxiety begins to fade, peace replaces panic, and strength returns little by little. While the situation may remain difficult, the heart becomes steady. This inner transformation is one of the greatest outcomes of prayer, allowing believers to endure without losing faith. Prayer also creates spiritual resilience. Dr. Cho explained that every time a believer chooses prayer instead of despair, faith is strengthened. Even when prayers seem unanswered, the act of praying itself builds endurance. Over time, faith learns to trust God's timing and wisdom. Persistent prayer teaches patience, humility, and dependence, qualities that prepare the heart for breakthrough. Eventually, prayer aligns the believer with God's purpose. Dr. David Yonggi Cho often reminded believers that prayer does not change God, but it changes us. When faith continues to pray in the darkest seasons, hope remains alive, and when hope remains, faith does not collapse. In God's perfect timing, answers come, not always as expected, but always in a way that fulfills His will. Persistent prayer ensures that even when nothing seems to be working, God's work is never stopped. When nothing is working and every effort seems to fail, the greatest challenge is learning to trust God's timing. Dr. David Yonggi Cho taught that impatience often leads to fear, anxiety, and discouragement. But faith finds rest in knowing that God's timing is always perfect. Trusting God's timing does not mean giving up hope. It means releasing the pressure to control outcomes. In that release, peace begins to replace frustration. God's timing is shaped by wisdom we cannot always understand. Dr. Cho explained that God sees the full picture, past, present, and future, while we see only a small moment. What feels delayed to us may actually be preparation. God may be aligning circumstances, protecting us from harm, or preparing us spiritually for what is coming. Faith learns to trust that God knows when the blessing will be most beneficial. Peace comes when faith stops fighting time. Dr. Cho emphasized that worry often arises from the desire to speed up God's process. When believers accept that God's schedule is not bound by human urgency, anxiety loses its grip. Trust does not eliminate problems, but it changes how those problems are experienced. Instead of panic, there is calm. Instead of fear, there is quiet confidence. Trusting God's timing also deepens spiritual maturity. Dr. Cho taught that waiting seasons refine faith, teaching patience and humility. In waiting, believers learn to rely on God's presence rather than His gifts. This shift strengthens faith, making it less dependent on immediate results and more rooted in relationship. Waiting becomes a season of growth rather than suffering. Eventually, trusting God's timing leads to breakthrough that brings peace, not regret. Dr. David Yonggi Cho often reminded believers that God never arrives too late, though He rarely comes early. When God's timing is fulfilled, the answer comes with completeness and purpose. Faith that trusts God's timing finds peace even before the breakthrough, knowing that when God acts, it will be worth the wait.